At this time, I'd like to take just a few minutes to explain what this debate is all about. It might be easier to start by explaining what this debate is not about. First of all, this debate is not about whether atheists can be good people. Both men here tonight agree that atheists can be good, moral people. Of course, no one's perfect, but both men agree that atheists can live good moral lives. That's not what the debate is about. Second, the debate tonight is not about whether morality is relative or not. That's a very common conversation and discussion and sometimes debate, but that's not the topic for tonight. Both men here reject the notion that morality is relative. Relative morality is the idea that there are no absolute, objective moral truths, that morality varies person by person or culture by culture, that there is no objective standard that exists beyond our personal opinions or cultural traditions. If moral relativism were true, it wouldn't be possible, for instance, for one culture to tell another culture that what they're doing is wrong or evil, because there's no objective moral truth they could appeal to. In other words, if morality was relative, you couldn't say that racism is objectively wrong. All you could say is that you don't like it. Both men here tonight debating reject this notion of moral relativism. They both believe some things are really right and some things are really wrong. That there are objective moral truths that exist independently beyond what we think and feel. Both men agree that morality exists somehow apart from us, as an objective, absolute standard that we can know and understand. In other words, both men are moral realists. They believe that moral truth is objectively real. So, for example, if everyone in the world tonight took a pill that caused them to think that rape was okay, even if we all woke up tomorrow believing that or thinking that rape was okay, it still would be morally reprehensible. It still would be objectively wrong because moral truth exists beyond our opinions and personal preferences. So what is this debate about? These two men seem to agree on quite a lot. Consider the title of the debate carefully. What is the best account of objective moral values and duties? As I said, both men believe in objective moral values and duties. The question is, what is the best account of these moral truths? Where do they come from? How can they exist? For centuries, some would say thousands of years, Western civilization believed that God provided the foundation for objective morality, that God was the best explanation for how these objective moral truths could exist outside of us. This is not only true of the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, but in fact, many ancient Greek philosophers also believed morality had a transcendent source. Some of them, including Plato and Aristotle, described this transcendent source in ways that are similar to how the Abrahamic religions describe God. However, during the 1800s, many people began to believe that God does not exist, that there is no such thing as God. Towards the end of the 1800s, Friedrich Nietzsche proclaimed that God was dead. Now, Nietzsche was an atheist. It's not as though he believed God used to be alive and then he got sick and died. No, he never believed that God ever existed. His point was that the idea of God was dying in Western culture. Many atheists, including Nietzsche, thought that this would radically affect people's moral beliefs. Since Western moral beliefs had been built on the idea that God provided the objective absolute moral standard, then rejecting God should have a tremendous impact on how people viewed morality. If there is no God, then how could objective moral truths really exist out there apart from our own ideas? If there's not a fixed point, an absolute standard, isn't morality just our personal opinions? This has been a vigorous conversation now for 200 years, and tonight's debate is just one piece of this intense conversation. Most all theists, including Dr. Craig here, believe that God provides the foundation for morality. They might have different explanations as to how God provides the foundation, either through God's commands, through God's nature, or through the human natures that God has created. But they all agree that ultimately, God provides the foundation of morality. Thus, if there is no God, then there is no foundation for objective morality. Many atheists agree with this conclusion, that if there is no God, there can be no objective morality. Thinkers such as David Hume, Charles Darwin, as I mentioned, Friedrich Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, Jacques Monod, Francis Crick, Jean-Paul Sartre, Gilbert Harman, J.L. Mackie, Michael Roos, Richard Dawkins, all agree that if there is no God, then there is no foundation for objective morality. Thus, these atheists agree with theists that if there is no God, then there is no foundation for objective morality. Other atheists, however, such as Dr. Wielenberg, have said no. Wait a minute, not so fast. Even if there is no God, this doesn't mean that there is no such thing as objective moral truth. In the last paragraph of his book, Robust Ethics, Dr. Wielenberg wrote that we should not be too quick to abandon the old-fangled idea that reality includes objective moral features. These atheists argue that it is a mistake to think that only God could provide the foundation for objective morality. Maybe something else provides that foundation. Or maybe objective moral truth doesn't need a foundation at all. Maybe objective moral truth exists on its own and doesn't need a foundation. This is the view that Erik Wielenberg will be arguing for tonight. Now, at this time, I have the honor of introducing our two debaters. First, Dr. William Lane Craig is a research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology and professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University. He earned a doctorate in philosophy at the University of Birmingham in England, before taking then a doctorate in theology from the University of Munich in Germany. A popular international lecturer on university campuses, Dr. Craig has authored or edited over 40 books, including his signature work, Reasonable Faith, as well as over 150 articles in professional journals of philosophy and theology. Many of his articles and debates can be found online at reasonablefaith.org. Dr. Erik Wielenberg is professor of philosophy at DePauw University in Greencastle, Indiana. He earned his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and spent a year at the Center for Philosophy of Religion at the University of Notre Dame while in graduate school. More recently, he was visiting fellow at the Center for Ethics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He's the author of 3 books, including Value and Virtue in a Godless Universe and Robust Ethics, the Metaphysics and Epistemology of Godless Normative Realism. I have to say, tonight's debate is going to be great. How do I know that? Well, the way that we've organized this debate is that these two men have exchanged their respective speeches over the last 12 months and have had their debate in writing, so they've had plenty of time to think through their responses and articulate their rebuttals very carefully. Since they've seen one another's speeches, both of them have been able to develop PowerPoints to go along with their speeches in both their opening and rebuttal speeches. One final note before we begin. If you would, please hold your applause until after each speaker is finished. Dr. Cray will begin now with his opening speech.
Thank you. It's an honor to be participating in this debate on God and morality with so provocative and incisive a thinker as Erik Wielenberg. The question before us this evening is, what is the best account of the objectivity of moral values and duties? What makes certain actions objectively good or evil, right or wrong? In tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, theism provides a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. Second, atheism does not provide as sound a foundation as theism for the objectivity of moral values and duties. So let's look at that first contention together. Here, I want to examine two subpoints with you. First, theism provides a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral values. Moral values have to do with what is good or evil. On the theistic view, objective moral values are grounded in God. As St. Anselm saw, God is, by definition, the greatest conceivable being, and therefore perfectly good. He is not merely perfectly good, he is the paradigm of moral value. God's own holy and loving character supplies the absolute standard against which all things are measured. He is, by nature, loving, generous, faithful, kind, and so forth. Thus, if God exists, moral values are objective, being wholly independent of human beings. Second, theism provides a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral duties. On a theistic view, objective moral duties are constituted by God's will or commands. God's moral nature is expressed in relation to us in the form of divine commandments, which constitute our moral duties or obligations. Far from being arbitrary, God's commandments must be consistent with his holy and loving nature. Our duties, then, are constituted by God's commandments, and these, in turn, reflect his essential character. On this foundation, we can affirm the objective rightness of love, generosity, and self-sacrifice, and condemn as objectively wrong selfishness, hatred, abuse, and oppression. In summary, then, theism grounds the objectivity of both moral values and moral duties. Hence, it's evident that if God does exist, we have a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. Let's turn then to my second contention, that atheism does not provide as sound a foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. I'm not going to argue this point in general. Rather, I want to look specifically at Dr. Wielenberg's view, which he calls godless normative realism, and ask whether it provides as sound a foundation for morality as theism. I'm going to argue that godless normative realism not only involves extravagant metaphysical commitments, which make it very implausible, but it also faces a number of formidable objections as an account of objective moral values and duties. First, godless normative realism involves extravagant metaphysical claims which make it very implausible. Because Dr. Wielenberg wants to affirm the objectivity and even necessity of moral values and duties, he cannot take them to be mere byproducts of biological evolution or social conditioning. Rather, he must find some transcendent ground for the objectivity of moral values and duties. He finds this in moral Platonism. His view is akin to mathematical Platonism, which holds that in addition to the world of concrete objects, there exists a transcendent realm of immaterial, causally effete, abstract objects like numbers, sets, and other mathematical entities. Most of us think that such entities have at most a sort of conceptual reality. But for the Platonist, these objects are objectively real. Wielenberg holds that moral values are similarly abstract objects of some sort, existing independently of human beings. When the right physical situations occur in the world, these abstract objects supervene on the situations. So, for example, the abstract object, goodness, supervenes on two people's loving each other, so that their loving each other is objectively good. Platonism is a metaphysical view which is so extravagant that it makes theism, which itself involves hefty metaphysical commitments, look modest by comparison. The prominent metaphysician Peter van Inwagen explains, the Platonist must think of objects of what there is as falling into two exclusive and exhaustive categories, the abstract and the concrete. If X falls into one of these categories and Y into the other, then no two things could be more different than X and Y. The differences between God and this pen pale into insignificance when they are compared with the differences between this pen and the number 4. Indeed, the number seems no more like the pen than like God. The difference between any abstract object and any concrete object would seem to be the maximum difference any two objects could display. Given this strange bifurcation of reality into these two causally unconnected domains, it would be much more credible to suppose that one of the categories is empty. But concrete objects are indisputably real and well understood, in contrast to abstract objects. So, Van Inwagen maintains, the presumption should be that abstract objects do not exist. Nominalism of some sort is thus the default position. Indeed, Van Inwagen believes one should not believe in abstract objects unless one feels rationally compelled by some weighty consideration or argument. A philosopher should wish not to be a Platonist if it's rationally possible for the informed philosopher not to be a Platonist. The objectivity of moral values cannot itself provide such a rationally compelling reason, since Dr. Wielenberg acknowledges that he has no rationally compelling arguments either for the objectivity of moral values or for moral Platonism. He thus cannot overcome the presumption against Platonism and hence against godless normative realism. The theist, by contrast, faces no such obstacle because he grounds moral values in a concrete object, namely God, and so is not committed to a realm of abstract objects. Thus, godless normative realism involves extravagant metaphysical claims which make it less plausible than theism. My second criticism is that even given the truth of moral Platonism, godless normative realism faces a number of formidable objections in its account of the objectivity of moral values and duties. First, its account of the supervenience of abstract moral properties on physical situations seems unintelligible. How is it that these abstract objects like goodness or badness come to be attached to physical situations? Dr. Wielenberg recognizes that it would be implausible to say that this just happens as if by magic. Rather, he claims that the physical objects cause the abstract objects to supervene on physical situations. This is not ordinary supervenience. This is what's been called super-duper venience. Unfortunately, this super-duper venience is utterly mysterious. Ask yourself, how can a physical object somehow reach out and causally connect to a transcendent, causally isolated, abstract object? Ironically, in order to make his claim plausible, Dr. Wielenberg has to appeal, of all things, to theism as an analogy to his view. He writes, "A paradigmatic example of the sort of robust causation that I have in mind is the causal relation that many theists take to hold between a state of affairs being divinely willed and the obtaining of that state of affairs. Theists typically maintain that if God wills that P, this necessarily brings it about, that P obtains. I propose to construe the making relation involved in supervenience as this sort of robust causation." Unfortunately, this analogy fails precisely because neither God nor the universe is an abstract object. God and the universe are concrete objects endowed with causal powers and dispositions, which can therefore be causally related to one another. But how physical objects can be causally connected to abstract objects is wholly obscure. Moreover, we may ask, how do these physical situations know which abstract objects to instantiate? What if instead of picking out moral goodness, some physical situation might pick out moral badness? Indeed, what if it picks out some other abstract object, like the square root of 2, to instantiate, so that two people's loving each other has the property of being the square root of 2? Wielenberg says that while some moral properties are caused necessarily to supervene on certain physical situations, in other cases they are only contingently caused to supervene. So, why does this happen? Again, ironically, Dr. Wielenberg turns to theism in order to explicate his position. He invites us to consider the doctrine of divine conservation. According to that doctrine, God not only brings all contingent things into existence, he also sustains or keeps them in existence for each moment that they exist. There is a robust causal relation between divine willing and every contingent thing at each moment of its existence. One way of construing my proposal, then, is as a doctrine of non-moral conservation. Whatever moral properties are instantiated are conserved or sustained by various underlying non-moral properties via a robust causal relation that holds between the relevant non-moral and moral properties. But once again, the analogy with theism fails, for God is a personal agent who freely chooses to instantiate in being certain contingent things. By contrast, Dr. Wielenberg says that his proposal should not be understood as ascribing agency to non-moral properties. But without agency, how can these physical situations correctly select the right moral states of affairs to instantiate. The problem is not just that the holding of this causal relation between non-moral and moral states of affairs is, by Dr. Wielenberg's own admission, inexplicable. The problem is that Wielenberg's view, which is supposed to be consistent with scientific naturalism, imputes to physical objects causal powers that are mysterious and completely unknown to contemporary physics. It is, in fact, a sort of voodoo metaphysics. Second objection. Godless normative realism's account of objective moral duties is seriously flawed. I'll mention two problems. First is in the absence of a divine lawgiver, why think that we have any moral obligations or prohibitions? On Dr. Wielenberg's view, moral obligations are constituted by having decisive moral reasons for doing some action. For example, if I'm trying to decide whether to steal someone's pocketbook, I examine the moral value of alternative actions and see that I have decisive moral reasons for not stealing the pocketbook. Therefore, I ought not to steal it. Dr. Wielenberg's view has the implausible implication that if you have decisive moral reasons for doing something, you are obligated to do it. That is incompatible with morally supererogatory acts, like sacrificing one's life for another. For even though such an act is supremely good, it is above and beyond the call of duty. Moreover, Dr. Wielenberg's view seems to imply that we are always obligated to do the best thing, whereas in some cases, we are obligated at most to do a good thing, not the best thing. Even if it were morally better, for example, for you to become a doctor rather than an engineer, you're not morally obligated to become a doctor, for both are good moral choices. In any case, having decisive moral reasons to do an act implies at most that if you want to act morally, then that is the act you ought to do. In other words, the obligation to do the act is only conditional, not unconditional. But a divine command provides an unconditional obligation to perform some act. A robust moral theory ought to provide a basis for unconditional moral obligation, which Wielenberg's view does not. The second problem is that Dr. Wielenberg's view subverts the objectivity of moral duties by undermining freedom of the will. Dr. Wielenberg endorses what he calls the causal closure of the physical. That implies that your mental states are causally effete. The mind has no effect on the body. The only causality is from physical brain states to mental states. Thus, mental states are causally impotent states, which just float along, as it were, on brain states. They do and effect nothing. In that case, everything you think and do is causally determined by prior physical states. You are an electrochemical machine, and machines have no moral obligations to do anything. Your body is not morally obligated to do anything. What about yourself, your mind? On Dr. Wielenberg's view, the self is just a succession of discrete mental states. There is no enduring subject which persists from one moment to another. Thus, there literally is no one who can be held morally accountable for prior acts. Moral praise and blame are impossible, since there is no enduring moral agent. Your perception of yourself as a moral agent and your sense of moral duties and accountability are illusions of human consciousness. Thus, the objectivity of moral duties, along with moral agency and moral accountability, is undone by godless normative realism. The third formidable objection I want to raise is that Dr. Wielenberg's view seems to make moral knowledge impossible. Dr. Wielenberg's account of moral knowledge seems vulnerable to Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. Plantinga argues that naturalism is self-defeating because if our cognitive faculties have evolved by naturalistic processes, they are aimed not at truth, but at survival, and so cannot be relied on to produce true beliefs. This is especially evident on Dr. Wielenberg's view, since our mental states have absolutely no effect on our brain states. Thus, the content of our beliefs is irrelevant to our survivability. But if we cannot rely on our cognitive faculties to produce true beliefs, then the belief that then the belief in naturalism is itself undermined, since it has been produced by those very cognitive faculties. We can apply Plantinga's argument to our moral beliefs as follows. 1, the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable, given naturalism and evolution, is low. 2, if someone believes in naturalism and evolution and sees that, therefore, the probability of his cognitive faculties being reliable is low, then he has a defeater for the belief that his cognitive faculties are reliable. 3, if someone has a defeater for the belief that his cognitive faculties are reliable, then he has a defeater for any belief produced by his cognitive faculties, including his moral beliefs. 4, therefore, if someone believes in naturalism and evolution and sees that, therefore, the probability of his cognitive faculties being reliable is low, then he has a defeater for the reliability of his moral beliefs. Because our moral beliefs have been produced by faculties aimed at survival, not truth, we can have no confidence that our moral beliefs are true. Dr. Wielenberg is acutely aware of this problem for godless normative realism. His very complex answer to this problem, simply put, is that the same cognitive processes that produce our moral beliefs also cause the abstract moral properties to be instantiated. Notice that this account depends crucially on the supposed causal connection between physical properties and abstract moral properties, which is perhaps the most obscure point in his philosophy. But Plantinga's argument gives us reason to doubt as well whether our cognitive processes, which supposedly cause certain moral properties to be instantiated, will trigger the appropriate moral beliefs rather than beliefs which are merely conducive for survival. Dr. Wielenberg reassures us that we are no more lucky in having true moral beliefs than we are in having true beliefs in general. But if Plantinga is right, it is an incredibly lucky coincidence, given naturalism, that our beliefs of any kind, including our moral beliefs, turn out to be reliable. The solution to this problem is to deny not evolution, but naturalism. On theism, God can supervise the evolutionary process in such a way as to guarantee the fundamental reliability of our cognitive faculties. Since Dr. Wielenberg, by contrast, is committed to naturalism as well as evolution, he has a defeater for the reliability of his moral beliefs. Godless normative realism thus makes moral knowledge impossible. In conclusion, it seems to me that theism provides a more plausible account of objective moral values and duties than does godless normative realism. The latter involves extravagant metaphysical commitments that render it more implausible than theism, and it faces formidable objections even given those commitments. Therefore, theism is the more plausible moral theory.
Good evening. I am honored and excited to have this opportunity to exchange ideas with Dr. Craig. Let's begin by considering a simple example. Imagine that on your way home tonight, you encounter a child whose arm is engulfed in flames. Suppose the child is screaming in pain and for help, and that nearby is a large bucket of water. No one else is around. Now, Craig and I agree that in this scenario, the suffering of the child is bad, and that you are morally obligated to try to douse the flames. We also agree that these facts about badness and obligation are objective. We disagree, however, about the nature of the badness of the child's suffering and of the obligation to help the child. In his opening speech, Dr. Craig said that God's character is the absolute standard of value, and that divine commandments constitute our moral obligations or duties. Craig's view is that for an act to be morally obligatory, just is for that act to be commanded by God, in much the way that for something to be water, just is for it to be H2O. For Craig, the badness of the child's suffering consists in that suffering conflicting with God's character, and your obligation to help the child consists in God having commanded you to help. Atheists must reject such a view. Some atheists deny the reality of objective morality. Others propose that moral features are really just natural features of the world. Dr. Craig and I both find such views to be implausible. My view is that these moral features of things are fundamental features of reality, not reducible to any other thing. That is not to say that the moral features of reality do not have sources. In the child on fire case, the intrinsic nature of the child's suffering makes that suffering bad. The suffering is bad in and of itself, just as on Craig's view, God is good in and of himself. Furthermore, the child's suffering, the presence of a bucket of water, and so on, give rise to your moral obligation to douse the flames. As Dr. Craig explained in his opening speech, my theory is that various features of the situation cause you to be obligated to help, and this causal connection is as strong as that between God willing that a certain thing happen and the willed thing happening. My aim tonight is to make the case that my view is more plausible than Dr. Craig's view. Since we are considering the relative plausibility of two views, whenever we are presented with an objection to one of the views, we should consider whether there is a similar objection to the other view, so that the two objections cancel each other out. It seems to me that a great many of the objections to my view that Dr. Craig advanced in his opening speech are matched by corresponding objections to his view. For example, consider Craig's argument that my proposed causal connection between natural and moral features of reality is implausible because it is difficult to imagine how such a causal connection could hold. Craig's view posits causal connections between wholly non-physical entities, such as God and souls on one side, and the physical universe on the other. When Descartes championed such a view back in the 17th century, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia objected that it is difficult to imagine how such a causal connection could hold. And dualism's critics have complained ever since that the nature of this alleged causal relationship is, in Craig's words, wholly obscure. The prominent metaphysician Peter Van Inwagen, to whom Craig appealed as an authority on metaphysical matters in his opening speech, rejects dualism on precisely these grounds. So there is no advantage for Craig's view here. The same is true of Craig's charge that I cannot explain why a given physical situation possesses one moral feature rather than another. Craig's view faces a corresponding challenge. On Craig's view, if God commands you to do something, then necessarily you have a powerful reason to do that thing. But what explains why there is a necessary connection between an act being commanded by God and there being a powerful reason to do the act? What if instead being commanded by God entails there being a powerful reason not to do the act? This worry mirrors Craig's worry that I cannot explain why, for example, the natural features of the child on fire scenario make it morally obligatory for you to help the child rather than to fan the flames. Furthermore, Craig's skepticism about the natural world's ability to generate moral features of things should be viewed in the context of his commitment to the existence of an unsurpassably good person who is generated by nothing. Craig's Anselmian view has it that a causeless, unsurpassably good being exists in every possible universe. Craig wonders how, on my view, a given situation knows which moral features to instantiate. We might similarly wonder how, on Craig's view, every single possible universe knows to instantiate exactly one uncreated being that is loving, generous, faithful, kind, and unsurpassably good. How do the various properties know to knit themselves together in every possible universe? The upshot here is that both Craig's view and mine posit unexplained necessary connections, and hence it is fruitless for one of us to complain about the other's commitment to such connections. Now, Craig also says that my view imputes to physical objects causal powers that are completely unknown to contemporary physics, and for that reason is a sort of voodoo metaphysics. But Craig's dualism implies that some physical objects can causally influence non-physical souls, causal powers that are also unknown to contemporary physics. And so I say to Dr. Craig, join me, brother, in the church of voodoo metaphysics. Craig also alleges that my view undermines the existence of the self, free will, and moral knowledge. Since Craig simply asserts that on my view there is no enduring self, but provides no explanation of how my view might have such an implication, there's not really an argument here to which I might respond. In the case of free will and moral knowledge, Craig's arguments rest on the claim that my view implies that mental states have no causal impact on the physical world. Craig notes that I accept the widely held causal closure of the physical principle, according to which any physical event that has a cause has a complete physical cause. Craig further claims that this principle implies that mental states are causally effete. However, the causal closure principle by itself does not secure that conclusion. The further premise that no mental state is also a physical state is required. But the claim that no mental state is also a physical state is highly contentious. There are various theories about how mental states could be reducible to or constituted by certain sorts of physical states. Because Craig doesn't address any of these theories, his claim that I must deny that mental states can affect the physical world is inadequately supported. Additionally, Dr. Craig's own theories about free will, the self, and moral knowledge require causal interaction between the physical and non-physical, which, as I noted earlier, has been questioned in precisely the way Craig questions causal interaction between the physical and the moral. A more interesting objection Craig poses is that my view is incompatible with morally supererogatory acts. Craig offers the examples of sacrificing your life for others and becoming a doctor rather than an engineer. I have two thoughts here. First, I'm not convinced that Craig's view allows such acts to be above and beyond what is morally obligatory. Although Craig spoke only of generic theism in his opening speech, his view is a version of Christian theism, according to which one of God's central commands to us is to love others as we love ourselves. If you could save the lives of others by sacrificing your own life or becoming a doctor rather than an engineer, it seems plausible that you'd be morally obligated to do so in order to live up to a moral requirement to love others as you love yourself. So, if Dr. Craig wishes to press the supererogation objection, he owes us an explanation of how his own view, accommodates his own examples. Second, my view could be tweaked to allow for the possibility of supererogatory acts by incorporating Joseph Raz's concept of exclusionary permission. Raz suggests that there is value in us being able to form our own plans and ideals for our lives, and that value can generate reasons to refrain from acting on the total balance of moral reasons if doing so would be deeply at odds with our own life plans. Acting on the total balance of moral reasons anyway in such cases is supererogatory. This approach fits nicely with Craig's doctor example. If you've built your life around becoming an engineer, that can give you a reason to refrain from acting on the total balance of moral reasons and becoming a doctor. On this approach, an act is morally obligatory for you just in case you have decisive moral reasons for doing it and no exclusionary permission to refrain from acting on those reasons. So Craig's remarks about supererogatory acts don't reveal an advantage of his view over mine. I turn now to challenges for Craig's theistic account of objective morality. I will present 3 such challenges. In his opening speech, Craig said that while divine commands provide unconditional obligations to perform certain actions, my view fails to provide a basis for unconditional moral obligations. These remarks reveal a claim that lies at the foundation of Craig's critique of secular morality, as well as his influential moral argument for God's existence. The claim is that there is one and only one feature that can give rise to genuine moral obligations, and that feature is being commanded by God. But this claim is implausible. Recall the child in flames case I described earlier. Consider the following elements of that case. The child is in agony. You can easily reduce his agony at no cost to yourself, and no one else can help the child. Craig's position is that those features of the situation do not generate a genuine obligation to help the child. On Craig's view, God's command alone creates the obligation to help. Such a position is at odds with moral common sense. Imagine a view according to which the one and only thing that can make you morally obligated to do something is making a promise to do that thing. On this view, if you encounter a suffering child who you and no one else can help, you're only obligated to help if you've previously made a promise to help suffering children. Indeed, you're only obligated to refrain from torturing children for your own entertainment if you've previously promised not to do so. The straightforward defect in this view is that there are a whole host of features of the world that can generate moral obligations aside from promise-making. Craig's view of morality is similarly flawed in that it mistakenly identifies one morally relevant feature as the only possible source of moral obligations. My theory, by contrast, accommodates the common sense view that divine commands, promises, needless and easily preventable suffering, along with a host of other factors, can generate genuine moral obligations. A second challenge for Craig's view stems from the fact that commands carry moral weight for the people to whom they are issued only to the extent that those people are aware of the commands and the authority of the commander. Consider parents and children. Parents have some authority to lay moral obligations on their children by commanding them to do things, at least when the children are sufficiently young. But such commands create obligations only when the children are aware of those commands and the authority behind them. For example, a parent cannot lay moral obligations on her children via anonymous notes that the children do not realize originate with the parents. Or consider my son, who, upon seeing me approach with a certain look on my face, will sometimes close his eyes, cover his ears, and run away, so that he cannot receive any command I might try to give him. Suppose that while he is in this state, I command him to retrieve a particular toy from beneath the sofa cushions. My command does not lay upon him an actual obligation to retrieve that toy. While he is subject to moral criticism on various grounds, he is not guilty of violating an obligation to retrieve the toy, for no such obligation was created in the first place. The relevance of this is that there are many non-believers in the world who are either unaware of or do not recognize divine authority behind any divine command. God's commands fail to impose moral obligations upon these non-believers. And given Craig's position that all human moral obligations are constituted by divine commands, Craig's view has the implausible implication that non-believers have no moral obligations whatsoever. I should emphasize that the problem is not that Craig's view implies that non-believers lack knowledge of their moral obligations. Rather, the problem is that Craig's view implies that non-believers literally lack moral obligations altogether. A third challenge is that Craig's view makes the occurrence of morally wrong actions inexplicable. Consider the child in flames case. On Craig's view, the immorality of ignoring the child consists in there being a divine command to help the child. Some people would ignore the child despite being divinely commanded to help. Being omniscient, God knows in advance that such people will ignore the child despite his commands. So what reason does God have to command those people to help the child? On Craig's view, the act of ignoring the child is already evil independently of God's commands. By commanding those he knows won't obey anyway to help the child, God exacerbates the evil of ignoring the child, making it also a case of violating a moral obligation. It can't be that God issues the command in an attempt to prevent the evil act from being performed, since he knows in advance that the command won't prevent the act. The command makes the act more evil, which gives God a reason not to issue the command. God can give different commands to different people. Why wouldn't he issue a command only when the command would make a difference in the commanded person's behavior? Craig's theistic approach appears to predict a world in which no one ever violates a moral obligation, and that is clearly not our world. I'll conclude by summarizing the main claims I've made. First, the issue before us is whether my view or Craig's view is more plausible. That means that whenever we are evaluating the force of a given objection to one of these two views, we should always consider whether there is a corresponding objection to the other view. As I've argued, many of Craig's objections to my view are matched by corresponding objections to his own view, and so provide no reason to favor his view over mine. Craig's remaining objections are inadequately supported or can be met. Most importantly, I've explained three considerations that support my view over Craig's. The first is that Craig singles out divine commands as the only possible source of moral obligations, thereby arbitrarily selecting one of many apparently weighty moral features as the only one that can ground moral obligations. The second is that Craig's view yields the implausible result that non-believers have no moral obligations at all. Finally, morally wrong acts are inexplicable on Craig's view, since they require that God inexplicably commands people to do what he knows they won't do anyway, thereby pointlessly introducing additional evil into the world. When we put these three considerations together, we see that there are tensions between Craig's view and some of the most fundamental elements of morality, tensions that my view does not possess. And so it seems to me that my view is the more plausible of the two views under consideration here.
Thank you, Dr. Wielenberg, for that vigorous response. Dr. Wielenberg has responded to both of the contentions I propose to defend tonight. First, theism provides a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. Wielenberg offers three objections to this contention. One, Craig's view arbitrarily singles out divine commands as the only possible source of moral obligation. I disagree. There can be a hierarchy of sources of moral obligation, with God's commands as the ultimate source. Divine command theory does not claim that in every moral situation, God issues a specific command to every person. That would turn the universe into a haunted house. Rather, God has issued general commands to all of humanity, such as, love your neighbor as yourself. And then, in any specific moral situation, it will be up to us to apply that general principle in determining our duties. And we'll take into account a host of derivative moral facts and principles, such as, I ought to keep my promises. Taking God's commands as the ultimate source of moral obligation in a hierarchy of sources is hardly arbitrary, as Wielenberg charges, since in the absence of God and his commands, it's hard to see any reason why, on atheism, these lower sources would generate any objective moral obligations. That's why so many atheists, such as Nietzsche, Russell, and Sartre, agree that in the absence of God, we have no moral obligations. Two, Craig's view implies that non-believers have no moral obligations, since many people are unaware of God's commands and authority. I find this a weak objection. On the Christian view, God has written the demands of his moral law on the hearts of all people, so that they have an intuitive grasp of the content of God's commands and their authority, even if they do not recognize them as gods. Matthew Flanagan gives the engaging analogy of walking along a beach until you come to a fence and a padlocked gate with the sign, "No trespassing." Even though you do not know who posted the sign, you grasp the content and the authority of the prohibition. That suffices for your obligation to proceed no further. 3. Craig's view makes morally wrong acts inexplicable, since God inexplicably commands people to do what he knows they won't do. I was surprised at this objection because it presupposes that God has what theologians call middle knowledge. That is to say, knowledge of what people would freely do in various circumstances. While I believe that God has middle knowledge, this doctrine is hardly part of divine command theory and is even rejected by some of its proponents, such as Robert Adams. In any case, by issuing general commands to humankind, God is able to hold those who do evil acts responsible for their actions. It makes God's retributive justice possible. Without such commands, evildoers could act with impunity and face no divine judgment, for they wouldn't have done anything wrong. They would literally get away with murder, which is unacceptable. In summary, I don't think that Dr. Wielenberg has offered any very powerful objections to my first contention. So, what about my second contention? Atheism does not provide as sound a foundation as theism for the objectivity of moral values and duties. Dr. Wielenberg's basic strategy in responding to my objections to his view is what's called in non-philosophical circles the so's your old man strategy. That is to say, you just throw the objection back in the face of your opponent. He's got the same problem that you do. There are two weaknesses with the so's your old man strategy. First, it doesn't really answer the objection. The alleged problem with your view remains unresolved. You just say that the other guy's view is as bad as yours. Second, if your opponent can show any relevant difference between his view and yours, then the strategy collapses and you're left with an unresolved problem. I think this is what happens in Wielenberg's case. My first main objection was that godless normative realism involves extravagant metaphysical claims, which render it very implausible. Wielenberg's metaphysical view is moral Platonism, which postulates an infinity of abstract moral objects. By contrast, theism is much less extravagant than Platonism, since God, though immaterial, is a concrete object. I've reviewed Dr. Wielenberg's opening speech carefully, and he provides no response to this objection. He needs to give us some convincing argument for Platonism. As one who's pretty familiar with the literature on this subject, I'm confident that there is no such argument. Hence, Wielenberg's metaphysics of morals is highly implausible. My second main objection is that even given moral Platonism, godless normative realism faces a number of formidable objections. First formidable objection: Wielenberg's account of the supervenience of abstract moral properties on physical situations seems unintelligible. In response to my objection that it is wholly obscure how physical objects can be causally connected to abstract objects, Wielenberg responds that it is also obscure how non-physical entities, like God, can be causally connected to physical entities. Two responses come to mind. First, how non-physical and physical entities can be causally connected is not as obscure as how concrete and abstract objects can be causally connected. For as I explained, God and the world are both concrete objects endowed with causal powers, and therefore a causal connection between them is not as obscure as such a relation between concrete and abstract objects, which are utterly diverse. Second, in the case of our own selves, we have experience of the causal connection of our immaterial souls or mind with our body, even if we do not understand how it works. Indeed, our most intimate acquaintance with causation is our mind's ability to affect our body. By contrast, we have no experience of a causal connection between abstract and concrete entities. Dr. Wielenberg does not answer my question. How do these physical situations know which abstract objects to instantiate? But he retorts that neither can I explain why God's commanding us to do something gives us a powerful reason to do it. This retort seems quite out of place. The retort is relevant to the debate over whether every moral theory must postulate some explanatorily ultimate facts. Suppose I grant, for the sake of argument, that divine command theory takes it as explanatorily ultimate that God's commands constitute our moral obligations, just as moral Platonism takes it as ultimate that some things are just wrong. That doesn't do anything to solve the problem of godless normative realism, that these blind causes somehow pick out the correct abstract objects to instantiate rather than some others. If you say, well, they just do, then you are postulating causal powers unknown to physics and inconsistent with scientific naturalism. It's of no consequence that the theist posits non-physical causes like God, because he is not a scientific naturalist, whereas the godless normative realist is. Wielenberg also retorts that on theism we have no explanation of how each possible world knows to instantiate God. This is a fanciful objection. Possible worlds do not causally instantiate God. If they exist at all, they are causally effete abstract objects. In my view, they do not exist, but are just useful fictions for visualizing and understanding modal discourse about possibility and necessity. Second formidable objection, Wielenberg's account of objective moral duties is seriously flawed. I mentioned two problems. First, the account precludes acts of supererogation. On theism, you can fulfill your duty to be a loving person without being morally obligated, say, to give up your life for someone else. Wielenberg offers to tweak his view by holding that you can ignore the total balance of moral reasons if following them would upset your own life plans. This is not tweaking his view, it is abandoning it. For now, moral obligations are not determined by having decisive moral reasons for doing some action, which contradicts normative realism. The second problem is that Wielenberg's view precludes moral obligation by undermining freedom of the will. The key here is his affirmation of the causal closure of the physical. This implies that nowhere in the causal history of a brain state is there a mental state. Remarkably, Dr. Wielenberg would avoid this conclusion by holding that mental states are physical states, at least in some cases. This sort of reductionism has long since been exposed as inadequate among philosophers of mind. For mental states have unique properties like intentionality, which no physical state can possess. In any case, in his view, no mental state can cause anything which was not already determined by the physical brain states, so that free will is still excluded. Moreover, an act of free will involves an exercise of active power or causal agency, which Dr. Wielenberg seems to recognize physical states do not possess. So on his view, there can be no free will, which makes nonsense of moral obligation. My third formidable objection was that Wielenberg's view makes moral knowledge impossible. Here, I appealed to Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. I don't know why Dr. Wielenberg chose to ignore this objection in his opening response, but it poses a huge problem for godless normative realism. It must be dealt with if his view is to be tenable. In conclusion, godless normative realism involves extravagant metaphysical claims and faces three formidable objections. By contrast, Dr. Wielenberg's objections to theism are not difficult to answer. Therefore, theism is the more plausible view.
Okay, I'm grateful to Dr. Craig for his clear and thoughtful response. Two preliminary points. First, Craig says my views of metaphysical commitments are more substantial than those of theism. Suppose he's right. Does it follow that my view is less plausible than his, all things considered? Only if Craig's view can make sense of objective morality as well as mine, which, as we'll see, it cannot. Second, if the topic of debate is whether my old man is a jerk, it's irrelevant for me to point out that your old man tortures puppies. But if the topic is whose old man is more of a jerk, and you say my old man tortures puppies, then your old man's treatment of puppies is relevant. If both old men torture puppies, then the puppy torturing issue sheds no light on whose old man is the bigger jerk. With that in mind, let's consider Craig's criticisms of my old man. Recall the child in flames. I say that various features of that scenario, the child suffering, the presence of a bucket of water, and so on, cause your moral obligation to douse the flames. Craig thinks that the child has a physical body and an immaterial soul, and that the child's immaterial soul causally affects the child's body. He says that natural to moral causation is more obscure than immaterial to material causation. But the alleged obscurity lies in the absence of a theory about how the causation occurs, and such a theory is equally absent in both cases. So there's no basis for claiming that one case is more obscure than the other. On Craig's rhetorical question about how situations know which moral properties to instantiate, consider Craig's Anselmian commitment to the view that certain properties are great-making properties that necessarily make things that have them great. Examples include power and knowledge. God allegedly possesses great-making properties to the maximum degree. That's what makes him unsurpassably great. But how do such properties know to enhance the greatness of things that have them? I say that being an instance of causing pain just for fun is necessarily wrong-making. Craig says that being powerful is necessarily great-making. Why do these properties work this way? I don't see why the answer they just do is more plausible in one case than the other. Craig says that my view undermines free will. His argument requires the controversial premise that no mental states are reducible to brain states. In his last speech, he claimed that, quote, this sort of reductionism has long since been exposed as inadequate among philosophers of mind, end quote. As a claim about the current state of the debate in philosophy, this is simply inaccurate. Craig also makes unsupported claims about what physical things cannot do. Given how limited our understanding of intentionality, agency, and the brain are, I frankly can't imagine what basis Craig thinks he has for such claims. Furthermore, no one has the slightest inkling as to how an immaterial soul can supposedly possess intentionality and agency. In light of all of this, the suggestion that immaterial souls can possess such features, but complex physical systems cannot, is nothing more than a wild guess. Craig also appeals to Plantinga's evolutionary argument. Plantinga argues, from the armchair, that any belief-forming creature produced by unguided evolution will probably tend to have lots of false beliefs. I'd say that if you want to know what sort of widgets a widget maker is likely to produce, then you should consider the widgets it has made. Similarly, if you want to know what sort of creatures unguided evolution is likely to make, then you should consider the creatures it has made. It seems to me that all creatures on Earth have been produced by unguided evolution. And the inspection of these creatures casts doubt on Plantinga's probability claim. For what we find are creatures that are pretty good at forming true beliefs, at least within certain domains. Dogs can't do philosophy, but they're pretty good at forming true beliefs about their immediate surroundings. Psychology is revealing more and more about the strengths and weaknesses of human cognition. While the picture is mixed, it's certainly not the case that humans tend to have false beliefs across all domains. Consideration of what unguided evolution has actually produced suggests that it tends to produce pretty reliable believers, and Plantinga's argument therefore fails at its first step. Finally, on supererogation, Craig says that on theism, you can fulfill your duty to be a loving person without being morally obligated to give up your life for someone else. But Christian philosopher Christian Miller notes that another Christian command is to be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Commenting on this and other biblical passages, Miller concludes, quote, "For Christian theists, there seems to be no obvious textual evidence that God considers certain actions to be supererogatory. Instead, the New Testament authors are moved to stress the importance of forgiveness and grace, since no one will ever live up to their obligations on their own, much less go beyond them." End quote. So Craig's supererogation objection remains inconclusive. Now, what about my three challenges for Craig's view? Craig says that God imposes moral obligations on non-believers because he, quote, "has written the demands of his moral law on the hearts of all people, so that they have an intuitive grasp of the content of God's commands and their authority," end quote. But the existence of psychopaths refutes this theological claim. Psychopaths are incapable of empathy, love, or guilt, and cannot grasp the authority of moral demands. As psychologist Robert Hare explains, psychopaths lack the shackles of a nagging conscience. Psychologists Cordelia Fine and philosopher Jeanette Kennett say that for psychopaths, moral rules are annoying restrictions to be manipulated or ignored. None of these rules have normative force for them. Since psychopaths are incapable of grasping the authority of moral demands, it seems that God has not given them moral obligations, which means that on Craig's view, they have no obligations at all. This is a big problem for Craig, because one of his complaints about atheism is that it implies that psychopaths can do nothing wrong. Next, Craig's attempt to explain the existence of wrong action fails. Suppose God gives each of us an individualized conscience and commands us through it. Suppose each of us will encounter a flaming child after the debate. Suppose God knows that if he commands you to help, that will make the difference between whether you'll help or not. So he commands you to help, which you freely do, and the child is saved. But suppose God knows that regardless of whether he commands me to help, I'll heartlessly ignore the child. Given that, why bother with the command? The child won't be saved anyway, and my failure to help becomes a sin, introducing more evil into the world. Here's Dr. Craig's idea. I deserve punishment for heartlessly ignoring the child. So God commands me to help so that he can then punish me when I don't. But this is confused. If I deserve punishment for ignoring the child even without a divine command, then God can simply punish me. The command is superfluous. On the other hand, if what makes me deserve punishment for ignoring the child is that in doing so I violate a divine command, then the fact I deserve punishment obviously can't be God's reason for issuing the command in the first place. Craig's confusion here shows in his claim that without general divine commands in place, evildoers would, quote, literally get away with murder, end quote. But Craig holds that murder is wrongful killing, and without a divine command against killing, there's no wrongful killing on his view, and so no murder. Therefore, Craig cannot consistently say that without divine commands, evildoers would get away with murder, and the existence of wrong action remains inexplicable on his view. Finally, Craig says that only divine commands can be the ultimate source of moral obligations, meaning that only divine commands are sufficient by themselves to generate moral obligations. Again, consider the child in flames. Think of the child's agony and terror and how easily you could help. On Craig's view, those things by themselves cannot make it wrong for you to walk on by. Let's scale things up. Suppose you could stop 1 million Holocausts just by lifting a finger. To believe Craig's view, you have to believe that that by itself cannot generate a duty to lift that finger, cannot make it wrong for you to take a nap instead. Craig says that only an order from God can do that. Further, Craig's view implies that without God, there is nothing evil about 1 million Holocausts. Perhaps Craig will say that's because without God, there are no souls and so no pain, but that won't do. Keep the souls, keep the agony and terror of 1 million Holocausts, and Craig's view still says that without God, nothing bad is happening. That simply isn't plausible. To conclude, our topic is whether my theory or Craig's is more plausible. To the extent that Craig's charges of obscurity make trouble for my view, they make the same amount of trouble for his view and so settle nothing. Craig's other objections are inconclusive. Additionally, Craig's view still faces 3 serious problems: its inherent implausibility, as well as the sociopath problem and the mystery of wrongness.
Let's review Dr. Wielenberg's rebuttal to see if he's been able to sustain his objections or answer my objections. Consider first my first contention. Theism provides a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. Wielenberg objects, 1, Craig's view arbitrarily singles out divine commands as the only possible source of moral obligation. We've seen that that's not true. I recognize a hierarchy of sources of moral obligation. So does Dr. Wielenberg. So what's the problem? Wielenberg tells the story of the child in flames to try to prove that we have moral obligations which are not ultimately grounded in God. But the story shows no such thing. It shows at best that we do experience objective moral obligations, though even this is disputed by some of Dr. Wielenberg's fellow atheists. But it does not reveal to us the ultimate source of our moral obligations, for that is far beyond our experience. 2, Craig's view implies that non-believers have no moral obligations. We saw that you can recognize moral obligations without knowing the identity of the lawgiver. Wielenberg now appeals to the special case of psychopaths. But if psychopaths literally do not know the difference between right and wrong, then I'd say that on any plausible moral theory, they are not culpable for their evil acts. Such cases go no distance whatsoever to sustaining Wielenberg's original objection that an unbeliever cannot be aware of his moral obligations. 3, Craig's view makes morally wrong acts inexplicable. Wielenberg accuses me of vicious circularity. I plead not guilty. I did not say that by issuing general commands to humankind, God is able to hold those who do wrong acts responsible. Rather, I said that he is able to hold those who do evil acts responsible. The difference between good and evil is not grounded in God's commands, but in his being. So there is no vicious circularity in saying that by issuing divine commands, God is able to hold evildoers responsible for their actions. In summary, I think we can see that Dr. Wielenberg has failed to sustain his objections to my first contention. Turn now to my second contention, that atheism does not provide us sound a foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. I argued that 1, godless normative realism involves extravagant metaphysical claims, which render it very implausible. Wielenberg has still not offered any argument for postulating, in addition to concrete objects, a realm of abstract moral objects, independent of physical cosmogony and biological evolution. His metaphysical claims are not just substantial, but extravagant, and require justification. 2, godless normative realism faces a number of formidable objections. A, Wielenberg's account of the supervenience of abstract moral properties on physical situations seems unintelligible. The crucial consideration here is Wielenberg's contention that there is a causal connection between physical things and abstract objects. Wielenberg misses the point when he says that the alleged obscurity lies in the absence of a theory about how the causation occurs. No, the problem is that he is postulating a causal connection between physical objects and abstract objects where none seems to exist. There is a world of difference between this case and the causal connection between the soul and the body, which are both concrete objects endowed with causal powers. Or again, Wielenberg's physical causes are not agents, and so act blindly, which makes it unintelligible why they instantiate the right abstract objects. Wielenberg retorts, how do God's great-making properties know to enhance the greatness of things that have them? This objection is as misconceived as the earlier objection about possible worlds knowing how to instantiate God. The making here is clearly not causal. We just mean that if something is, say, powerful rather than weak, it is greater. There's no causality involved here at all. B, Wielenberg's account of objective moral duties is seriously flawed. I noted 3 flaws. Dr. Wielenberg responds to 2 of these. First, his account precludes acts of supererogation. He leaves aside his attempt to tweak his view and now instead claims that on Christianity as well, there can be no supererogatory acts. But his objection is based upon a false inference that perfect obedience to the divine law entails that there are no acts that go above and beyond what the law requires. In any case, Wielenberg has not shown that such a view is incumbent upon the divine command theorist. Second, his account precludes moral obligation by undermining freedom of the will. Wielenberg doubles down on the reducibility of mental states to brain states, but he did not respond to my 2 objections to this move. First, such a reductionism is untenable because mental states and brain states have different properties. For example, the brain does not possess mental properties like being hopeful, being loving, and being cheerful. That's why even physicalists have largely abandoned reductionism. Second, such reductionism precludes free will because mental states cannot cause anything which was not already determined by the physical brain states. Moreover, Wielenberg himself seems to recognize that physical states lack causal agency, which is a necessary condition of free will. And without free will, moral obligation goes out the window. Finally, Wielenberg's account makes moral knowledge impossible. In his rebuttal, Wielenberg responds to Plantinga's argument by denying his first premise, 1, the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable, given naturalism and evolution, is low. Wielenberg retorts, consideration of what unguided evolution has actually produced suggests that it tends to produce pretty reliable believers. But this response seems obviously question-begging. Unguided evolution is implicit in the combination of evolution and naturalism. But Plantinga argues that if evolution and naturalism were both true, that is to say, if evolution really were unguided, then it is unlikely that our cognitive faculties would be reliable. Since evolution selects on the basis of our behavior, not the truth of our beliefs, so long as we behave in survival-conducive ways, it doesn't matter what we believe. So, given naturalism and evolution, it's improbable that our cognitive faculties would yield mostly true beliefs. So, if naturalism were true, we could never know that evolution is unguided, much less that it has produced reliable believers, since that conclusion assumes that our observations and inferences are reliable. The same goes for our moral knowledge. If the evolutionary process has, in fact, yielded reliable believers, that gives good reason to think that naturalism is not true, contrary to godless normative realism. In summary, I think it's evident that Dr. Wielenberg has not been able to answer satisfactorily the formidable objections to his view, nor to sustain his criticisms of divine command theory.
In his last speech, Dr. Craig said that God's power makes God great without causing God's greatness. Apparently, Craig's view is that the connection between God's power and God's greatness is something that, in his words, just happens, as if by magic, a view he labeled implausible in his opening speech. In light of this, Craig's complaints about the alleged mystery of how, for example, torture for fun knows to instantiate wrongness remain toothless. On supererogation, Craig didn't address the point that Christianity teaches that God commands us to be perfect, which hardly leaves room for supererogatory acts. He then reasserted, still without argument, that human brains lack mental states and the ability to generate free actions. Bald assertion of such controversial claims settles nothing, particularly since Craig's theory of free will depends on utterly mysterious interaction between bodies and souls. Finally, Craig appealed again to Plantinga's argument. That argument also settles nothing. Think of it this way. Suppose I have a lighter, which I reasonably believe is a Bic lighter, and I find that it ignites on 99 of 100 tries. That makes it reasonable for me to believe that the lighter is reliable, even if I'm aware of some guy's armchair speculations that Bic lighters are probably unreliable. Similarly, if it's reasonable for you to accept naturalism, then it's reasonable for you to believe that unguided evolution has produced mostly reliable believers, and therefore that unguided evolution tends to produce reliable believers, despite being aware of Plantinga's armchair speculations about unguided evolution. If it's reasonable to believe naturalism, Plantinga's argument does nothing to change that. Craig's objections are ineffective. Let's now consider the challenges for Craig's view. In my last speech, I pointed out that to believe Craig's view, you'd have to believe that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is not sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. You'd also have to believe that without God, there's nothing evil in 1 million Holocausts. You may have noticed that Craig didn't dispute these implications of his view. Indeed, he didn't mention them at all. His only reply here is that, quote, "The ultimate source of our moral obligations is far beyond our experience," end quote. So I say that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. Craig says that it might seem that way, but really it takes an order from God to render that nap immoral. Second, Craig's view makes the occurrence of morally wrong acts inexplicable, because by commanding us to do what he knows we won't do anyway, God would only create more evil. In my last speech, I pointed out a simple defect in Craig's attempt to answer this challenge. Craig didn't address this defect in his last speech, so I'll just remind you of it. Suppose I perform some evil act, like heartlessly ignoring the suffering child. Craig says that because I deserve to be punished for my evil act, God must forbid the act so that he can then punish me. The problem, again, is that if the act deserves punishment because it is evil, then God is justified in punishing me for the evil act without first forbidding the act. As I said in my last speech, if I deserve punishment for ignoring the child even without a divine command, then God can simply punish me. The command is superfluous. Third, the presence of psychopaths in the world creates a contradiction within Craig's view. Psychological research shows that whether or not psychopaths know the difference between right and wrong, they are incapable of grasping the authority of morality. Remember that in trying to explain how God could impose obligations on people who don't believe in him, Craig proposed that by giving non-believers an intuitive grasp of morality's demands and authority, God is able to get his commands through and impose moral obligations on non-believers. However, because psychopaths cannot grasp morality's authority, God hasn't imposed any moral obligations on them, which means that, on Craig's view, they have no moral obligations. In a striking turn of events, Dr. Craig, despite having railed for years against atheism's inability to account for the moral wrongness of the acts of psychopaths, and having declared tonight that Christianity teaches that God has written the demands of his moral law on the hearts of all people, now entertains the possibility that psychopaths do not know the difference between right and wrong and are not culpable for their evil acts. But remember that in his flawed attempt to explain wrong action, Craig said that it was unacceptable for evildoers to get away with evil and that God would never permit such a thing. Here are Craig's own words, quote, "By issuing general commands to humankind, God is able to hold those who do evil acts responsible for their actions. Without such commands, evildoers could act with impunity and face no divine judgment, for they wouldn't have done anything wrong. They would literally get away with murder, which is unacceptable," end quote. So Craig must hold that psychopaths are culpable for their evil acts, and so do have moral obligations. For otherwise, some psychopaths would, as he puts it, literally get away with murder. We can now see that Craig has painted himself into a corner in tonight's debate. Since psychopaths are incapable of recognizing morality's authority, Craig must deny that they have moral obligations. Yet he must also hold that God doesn't let them get away with their evil acts, and so they do have moral obligations. I hope you will listen carefully to Dr. Craig's closing remarks and pay careful attention to what, if anything, he says about the three challenges I've just explained. The first two challenges show that Craig's view has deeply implausible implications, including that there are no wrong actions and that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is not sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. The third challenge is even more serious because it reveals a contradiction in Craig's position. Craig's position leads to the impossible view that psychopaths both do and do not have moral obligations. Please listen carefully to what, if anything, Dr. Craig has to say about these three challenges in his closing remarks.
I hope you've enjoyed tonight's debate as much as I have, and I want to thank Dr. Wielenberg again for his participation. Tonight we've examined two competing accounts of objective morals: theism and godless normative realism. I trust that the superior plausibility of theism has emerged in tonight's debate. First, theism provides a sound foundation of objective moral values. Theism posits God, a concrete object, as the standard of goodness. Godless normative realism, on the other hand, postulates a realm of strange, abstract moral objects that mysteriously supervene on physical states of affairs. If we can avoid such a bifurcated view of reality, we should do so, and that is just what theism enables us to do. Remarkably, Dr. Wielenberg has not offered any argument in defense of his moral Platonism, nor has he voiced a single objection to a theistic account of moral values. Second, Theism provides a sound foundation of objective moral duties. Our moral duties are constituted by the commands of an all-good God. Wielenberg's three objections to this account have been shifting throughout this debate. Initially, he objected that, on my view, God is the only source of moral obligation. After I explained why that is false, the objection morphed to the claim that moral experience shows that our moral obligations are independent of God. I denied that experience does show such a thing. Mark Murphy recently challenged Wielenberg on this score. He pointed out that our common moral experience shows the objectivity, universality, and finality of human morals, but it does not show such morals to be independent or non-derivative. In his reply, Wielenberg admitted, quote, "I concede that this particular common sense-based objection to theistic views is inconclusive," end quote. Wielenberg's second objection has also morphed from the initial claim that my view implies that non-believers have no moral obligations to the innocuous claim that mentally ill people, like psychopaths, are not morally responsible since their moral faculties are impaired. Finally, his third objection has also morphed from the curious assertion that my view makes morally wrong acts inexplicable to a spurious charge of vicious circularity. Dr. Wielenberg's objections to grounding moral duties in God have thus been in constant flux throughout this debate and have yet to reach a conclusive form. By contrast, we've seen several powerful objections to Wielenberg's account of moral duties. His account fails to provide unconditional moral obligations. His account precludes acts of supererogation. His account precludes moral obligation by undermining freedom of the will. I'll leave it to you to judge whether you think he has adequately answered these objections. Everyone who has been listening carefully to this debate knows that I did not simply assert those objections, as Dr. Wielenberg said in his last rebuttal, but gave arguments in their support, arguments which merit a serious response. It seems clear to me, then, that atheism is much superior to godless normative realism in providing a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. Finally, I argued that Wielenberg's account makes moral knowledge impossible. In his last rebuttal, Dr. Wielenberg was remarkably dismissive of Plantinga's argument, calling it armchair speculation. This shows that he's not yet grasped the force of this argument. The gist of the argument is that given that evolutionary theory requires that natural selection selects for adaptive behavior, not true belief, our ability to get along successfully in the world doesn't require that our cognitive faculties reliably produce true beliefs. Given unguided evolution, our faculties are probably not reliable, regardless of appearances, in which case moral knowledge becomes impossible. By contrast, on theism, our cognitive faculties, even if produced by evolution, are designed by God to yield true beliefs when functioning properly. So once again, the philosophical superiority of theism shines through. Having let go of God, atheists are understandably eager to stave off the moral nihilism that naturally attends their view. Godless normative realism is one such attempt. It is, however, a desperate attempt, far less plausible than the theism which it is intended to supplant.
Okay, I thank Dr. Craig for a very stimulating debate, and I hope we've given you some interesting ideas to think about. I've already explained why I think Craig's objections, to my view, are ineffective. As you reflect on Craig's objections, please remember that a galloping herd of ineffective objections carries the same weight as no objections at all. In my last speech, I explained the three serious problems with Craig's theistic view that have emerged tonight. As far as I can tell, Craig didn't address the substance of any of these problems in his closing remarks. First, a central pillar of Craig's view, his moral axiom that only divine commands are sufficient by themselves to generate moral obligations, is implausible. This axiom implies that being in a situation in which you have a choice between preventing a million holocausts and taking a nap is not by itself enough to make it wrong for you to take the nap. That implication alone seems to me to provide more than adequate grounds to set Craig's view aside and look for more promising alternatives. Since Craig mentioned my exchange with Mark Murphy in connection with this problem, you might be interested to know that Murphy rejects divine command theory on the grounds that it closes off the good of a small child's life from being the, or even a, wrong-making feature of harming the child. So, Wielenberg the atheist and Murphy the Christian are united in rejecting Craig's implausible moral axiom. I invite all of you to join us. Second, Craig's view predicts that there are no morally wrong actions. Craig has failed to explain why God wouldn't command people to do things only when his commands would influence behavior for the better. By adopting such a policy, God could prevent pointless evil from entering the world. Craig's proposal that God forbids evil actions so that he can punish evildoers fails, because if evildoing merits punishment, then God can simply punish people for their evildoing. Divine commands are unnecessary. Consequently, Craig's view cannot account for the existence of a single wrong action, and instead predicts that there are no wrong actions. This renders Craig's view inadequate as a foundation for objective morality. Third, the presence of psychopaths in the world reveals a contradiction in Craig's view. To explain how divine commands might impose obligations on non-believers, Craig proposed that every human being has an intuitive grasp of morality's authority. Without at least this grasp of morality's authority, God's commands can't get through, and so on Craig's view, no moral obligations are imposed. Psychopaths cannot grasp morality's authority. Craig's view therefore implies that psychopaths have no obligations. But Craig also claimed that God imposes obligations on all of humankind so that no one is outside the scope of divine justice, ensuring that no evildoers can act with impunity. Psychopaths are paradigmatic evildoers. Psychologist Robert Hare explains that psychopaths are rational and aware of what they are doing and why, and their evil acts result not from a deranged mind, but from a cold, calculating rationality. Craig's view, therefore, requires that psychopaths do have moral obligations. It is thus crucial to Craig's view that God has written the demands of his moral law on the hearts of all people, so that they have an intuitive grasp of God's commands and their authority. And yet, psychopaths walk among us, their hearts devoid of divine inscription. Their presence reveals that Craig's view is impossible, because it implies that psychopaths both do and do not have moral obligations. Tonight we've seen that if we grant Craig's extravagant metaphysical hypothesis of an uncaused, perfect, non-physical person that somehow interacts with the physical universe, if we suppose for the sake of argument that exactly the sort of God Craig believes in exists, then the resulting picture of morality is one of implausibility, inadequacy, and impossibility. And so I think that tonight's argument suggests that my view is more plausible than Craig's. Even if God is dead, objective morality abides.
At this time, we're going to enter the stage of the evening where the two debaters will be asked questions by you, the audience. Many of you have been emailing in your questions, so thank you for that. Let me explain a little bit how the question and answer time is going to work. Remember, you can email in your questions to Dr. Craig at questionsforcraig@gmail.com and your questions for Dr. Wielenberg to questionsforwielenberg@gmail.com. We're going to start with the question for Dr. Craig. He'll have 2 minutes to answer the question, and then Dr. Wielenberg will have 1 minute to respond. Then we'll have a question for Dr. Wielenberg and the same routine. He'll have 2 minutes to answer it, and then Dr. Craig will have a minute to respond. We'll go back and forth like this so that each debater gets an equal number of questions. So, Dr. Craig, the first question is for you. This comes from Riley Ferguson. If the theist yourself is claiming there's a God, then the burden of proof relies on you, the theist, to provide irrefutable, preferably empirical evidence that there is a God. How is it useful to use your claim that there is a God in your reasoning? In logic, you can't use an unproved statement as proof for another claim.
The question is, given the objectivity of moral values and duties, what is the most plausible account of these? And here the theist can certainly make the conditional claim that if God exists, then we have a plausible account of both objective moral values and duties, and that's unobjectionable. He doesn't have to bear the burden of proof to show that, that God exists. What I argued is that Platonism, however, does have a kind of presumption against it, that in the absence of some rationally compelling argument, the default position ought to be that abstract objects do not exist. And so I do think that the Platonist has a presumption of nominalism to overcome that the theist doesn't face, because the theist sticks with concrete objects as the explanatory ultimate for objective moral values and duties.
My turn? So I think this is a helpful question because I think it helps to bring out a certain parallel in the approach of Craig and I in thinking about morality and sort of the metaphysical underpinnings of morality. Because I think that for Craig and I, we both agree that there are objective moral facts, and that any argument against that is going to be less plausible than that claim itself. And so I think for us, the interesting philosophical question is not really whether there are these objective moral facts, but what's the most plausible sort of account of their foundation. So Craig has an influential moral argument for the existence of God, where he says God is the best explanation or provides the best account of these facts. And during the debate, you notice he repeatedly sort of challenged me to give an argument for my Platonic entities. And the argument I would offer for the entities posited by my view has the same structure as Craig's, which is I think those entities provide the best account of objective moral duty. So the argument I would give parallels Craig's moral argument, and that's why I think the issue of whether his theistic approach can account for objective moral facts is so crucial.
Okay, the next question is for you, Dr. Wielenberg. This comes from Anthony Dunn. And he says, he asks, did you arrive at your position of godless normative realism through inductive means or deductive means? How can you be certain you have arrived at the correct set of moral principles?
Okay, so it kind of sounded like there were two questions. I mean, I'm going to, in the end there, I thought it was maybe it turned into a question about how do I know I've got the correct moral principles, but I think the first part of the question seemed to be about how do I know I've got the right metaphysical foundation. Sorry, can I ask you if you,
yeah,
your sort of take on it?
So yes, so he's asking how did you arrive at your overall position, your model, through inductive or deductive means?
Okay. So Winston Churchill has this famous remark about democracy, which is something like it's the worst of all forms of government except for all the others that have been tried. That's my attitude toward my own metaethical theory. what Dr. Craig is calling moral Platonism. And so I think, abductive or deductive, I think it's a kind of argument to the best explanation, in the sense of, again, what makes the best sense of the reality of objective moral facts. So a full-blown argument, from my view, because you can see through the Churchill remark, it involves ruling out all of the other alternatives. That's obviously a large task. What I've tried to do tonight is to make the case that Craig's particular theistic approach doesn't do the job. That obviously knocks down, if my argument succeeds, just one competitor to my view. But my general approach is, again, it parallels Craig's, I think, approach in his moral argument for God's existence. We've got these objective moral facts. What makes the best sense of them? What's the account? So I would describe it loosely as an inference to the best explanation. And so the argument I would offer is, it turns out we've got to posit these entities to make sense of objective moral facts. And again, I tried to make the case tonight that Craig's theistic approach doesn't work. So that'll be part of the larger argument I try to give.
I'd like to identify a false assumption that seems to underlie both of the questions that have been posed this evening. And that is that one has to have some sort of certainty about these conclusions in order to be justified in holding them. The first questioner asked, do you have irrefutable arguments? The last questioner asked how Erik could be certain of his conclusions. These are false standards of success in argumentation. And that's why what we've argued tonight is which view is the more plausible view, which one has the balance of evidence and argument in its favor. But the quest or demand for certainty is a will-o'-the-wisp that will ultimately lead to sheer skepticism.
Amen, brother.
All right, the next question for you, Dr. Craig. This comes to us from Marcin Kulis. Dr. Wielenberg claims that your views imply that without God's command, there is no evil act committed. Is God's intrinsic... My turn. Is God's intrinsic goodness sufficient for providing a basis for objective morality without special revelation?
She misunderstood Dr. Wielenberg. He did not say that in the absence of divine command, nothing would be evil. What he said was that in the absence of divine command, nothing would be wrong. And that's the difference between values and duties. Moral values are rooted in the very nature of God, and so there would still be evil acts that would be done, even if they were not prohibited by God, and therefore wouldn't technically be wrong acts. And one would then raise this question that Dr. Wielenberg does, well, why would God command then people to do things when he knew that they wouldn't do them, so that they now become not only evil, but wrong? I think it's important to understand that every one of us is comprised in this situation. Every one of us is a fallen creature who does evil things and are infected with evil. God communicates his will to us for our own good. Not to communicate his will to everyone would allow people to remain in their evil condition. And in that fallen state, they could never be able to enjoy communion with God. But God is not content to allow us to remain in such an evil state. Instead, he does everything he can to save us. And by communicating to us his moral law, he helps people to see that they've cut themselves off from God. He helps them to repent, to seek God's grace and forgiveness, so that God's giving us his law helps us to understand our need for grace and to accept it, and so ultimately to find salvation. Otherwise, evildoers would never be able to enjoy union with God, which would comprise all of us.
Okay, that's interesting. So here's I think during the debate, it became clear that Dr. Craig hadn't answered the objection about why, the challenge to explain why God would command people to do things we know won't make a difference anyway. So now the idea seems to be he commands us to do what will make us happy, and this helps us get out of our fallen state, and it's sort of so for our own good. So I guess one challenge I would offer there goes back to what Craig was saying earlier about the distinction between how good and evil are treated on his view and how moral obligations are treated on his view. So one thought is that God could simply, since even without the commands, good and evil exists, God could simply inform us about, give us knowledge of the goodness and evil of our actions. So it's still, I guess, not clear to me why the commands would be necessary.
The next question is for you, Dr. Wielenberg, and this comes from Wesley Farewell from my home state of Nebraska. He asks, does your view address cases where moral duties conflict? For example, the classic case of lying to protect Jews from Nazi soldiers that appear at your door.
Yeah, so the way, the view I hold, the sort of where what is morally required of us depends on what moral reasons we have, is similar to the view put forward by the early 20th century philosopher W.D. Ross. So the basic idea is morality is kind of messy. There are all these different things that provide moral reasons for us to do certain things or not do certain things. And it's when you're trying to figure out what to do, a lot of times it's just a matter of weighing these reasons against each other. And so I would think in that case, I mean, that's just a particularly difficult case in the sense that you've got sort of weighty moral reasons on both sides, and it may be very difficult to know what the right thing to do is. So there are a lot of easy cases, like if you've promised to meet someone for lunch, and here's a classic example from philosophy land, filled with drowning babies. So you've promised to meet someone for lunch, you're passing through philosophy land, here's a drowning baby. If you save the baby, you'll break the promise. There it seems clear that the reason to the importance of saving the baby outweighs the promise. But there are other cases that are harder. I think if the question is about conflicting duties, I would think of those cases as cases where you just have weighty reasons on both sides, and it's hard to tell what your duty is, but there wouldn't literally be conflicting duties. There would be one actual obligation. It can just be very hard to know what it is when you've got weighty reasons sort of pulling in conflicting directions.
It seems to me that this highlights the problem of trying to derive moral obligations from simply normative considerations of weighing the moral values of alternative actions. Indeed, it makes me wonder what the situation with psychopaths would be on this sort of view, since they wouldn't be capable, in many cases I should think, of weighing the moral norms required to have an obligation. Certainly mentally retarded people and infants and people in comatose conditions would not be able to derive moral obligations in that way. Whereas I would say on my view, I was talking about normal moral agents, not mentally ill people, comatose people, little infants, mentally retarded. That's what I meant when I was referring to being written on the hearts of all people, was normal moral agents.
Okay, Dr. Craig, the next question is for you. The questioner asks, why should we obey God's commands? Where does that should come from? How is that should grounded in God?
Right. This relates to the question that came up a little bit in the debate about whether or not your moral theory has some sort of explanatory ultimate which cannot be further explained. And it seems to me the divine command theorist could say simply that this is my theory, that divine commands constitute our moral obligations, and therefore the question arises, doesn't even arise, well, why should I obey God's commands? Because that just is the theory that you're giving, and this is an explanatory ultimate that doesn't have a further explanation. Seems to me that would be perfectly legitimate move. But he could say something else. He could say that we are to obey God's commands because God has commanded us to. And that would not be viciously circular. For example, all of the things mentioned in the debate tonight is itself mentioned in the debate tonight. So there are things that are included in themselves. And if God issues a command, you shall obey all of my commands, that command itself would be comprised in that command. And so in this case, you're not left with some sort of brute explanatory ultimate. Rather, you would have an explanation for why you should obey God's commands, because God has commanded you to obey all his commands, including that one. So it seems to me that that would be a perfectly acceptable answer to the question that was raised by the questioner.
Okay, so I think this question is helpful. It brings out another sort of important parallel between, I think, mine and Craig's view, and actually, as far as I can tell, anybody who wants to believe in objective moral truths or facts, which is, at some point, you're going to need a moral axiom, where you have some basic moral claim or principle which has no further explanation outside of itself. And so I think sometimes in debates between theists and atheists about morality, it's presented this way: well, on the theist view, God is the foundation, then on the atheist view, they sort of have no foundation. That's very misleading. I think both views require moral axioms. The only difference is which moral axioms. On the particular question of why obey God's commands, I would just point out that the sort of most prominent defenders of divine command theory, for example, Robert Adams, they realized that this is a very pressing question. Robert Adams spends a lot of time trying to provide reasons to obey God's commands, and in doing so, he inevitably, predictably appeals to unexplained, brute moral axioms. So I think you can't get away from that.
Okay, Dr. Wielenberg, this next question is for you. It comes from Spencer Smith. He says, Dr. Wielenberg, in your book, you discuss two alternative analyses of the making relation. One is causation, and one is grounding. Do you think that analyzing making as grounding rather than causing would help you to escape Dr. Craig's objection concerning the obscurity of concrete abstract causation?
Maybe, but I don't feel the force of that objection. Again, especially if it's the question is which view is more plausible. As I was suggesting in the debate, Craig's view involves a particular causal relation, which, I mean, in the history of philosophy is sort of notorious. Its critics routinely point out this is obscure. Again, it goes back to, in this letter from Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, where she was making the case that, if you've got a physical body and a totally non-physical soul, how the heck could these two things interact with each other? And the challenge was, how does it work? What's the mechanism? What's the sort of explanation? And so I think that if there's a challenge for my idea that, like, the particular, in the child on fire case, the natural features of that situation cause you to have the obligation to assist. If there's a worry there, it's the same kind of worry, like, how does it work? In the end, I don't actually think that these worries are actually big problems. So let me come to 2 points here. There's a similar problem for both Craig and I, and there's not really a difference there. I mean, the heart of the matter is there's no theory as to how this causation works. But I guess, again, the important thing to see is if you think there's causation, you always get to a point where you just say, that's just how it is. There's no further story as to how it works. You see this in physics all the time. You eventually get to a point where they're just like, yeah, that's just how it works. That's just what the universe does. Things are this way, that makes things be this other way. How does it work? It just does it. So again, this is a problem that everyone has. I mean, if there's going to be causation at all, there's got to be some causation where there is no further story as to how the causation works. So I think that it's important to see that can't be a fatal objection to a theory, because then most theories will be out the window.
I think what Dr. Wielenberg just said undermines his view. Eleanor Stump, a Christian philosopher, recently pointed out that our inability to explain how the mind affects the body is not a serious objection because, as Dr. Wielenberg says, we don't even understand how matter affects matter. Ultimately, we don't really understand how any of this stuff works. So how can you indict mind-body causation when you don't even understand body-body causation? The point is that in the connection of our own minds with our bodies, we do experience that it occurs, even if we don't know how it occurs. But we do not know that it occurs between these non-moral properties and these moral properties. If you have a drug that you know that it works, it doesn't matter if you don't know how it works, but you do know that it works. And in this case, we're missing the that when it comes to Platonism.
Okay, Dr. Craig, the next question is for you. This comes from Peter Newell, and he asks, can you give a fuller explanation about whether or not psychopaths are morally responsible? And if they're not, how does that align with the Bible?
Right. I can't because I'm not a psychologist, and I have not read literature on psychopathy, so I can only speak conditionally on this to say, if it is really true that a psychopath cannot grasp the difference between right and wrong, then in the eyes of the law, he lacks a culpable mental state. In order to be found guilty, the accused needs to have an act of wrongdoing, which in the law is called an actus reus, and a culpable mental state, a mens rea. And when people are found not guilty because of insanity, for example, it's not because they didn't do the act, it's because of their mental illness. They're found not guilty due to insanity. And the question would be, do psychopaths fall into that category or not? If they do, then the law would say they're not guilty by reason of mental defect. And so on anybody's moral theory, you wouldn't want to say that they failed to live up to their moral obligations. But if they do grasp the difference between right and wrong, then they will be held morally culpable by the law for their crimes. And my limited experience with psychopaths is that they do grasp and can grasp the difference between right and wrong, even if they lack feelings of empathy for their victims, feelings of compassion. A good example of this is David Wood, who those of you who are Christians will know is a prominent Christian thinker who is a psychopath. He tried to murder his father and became a Christian while in prison. And David testifies to the fact that he could grasp the difference between right and wrong, even if he still lacks the sort of feelings of empathy with people that would characterize a normally healthy person.
So psychopathy is an interesting disorder. I think I'll just mention some of the sources. So Dr. Craig mentions one case of David Wood. I don't know David Wood, so I can't comment on that case. There's a substantial body of research in psychology devoted to psychopathy in particular. Robert Hare is one of the main figures. He has a book called Without Conscience. A student of his has a book called The Psychopath Whisperer. And so that's sort of the body of research I'm drawing on and when I bring psychopaths into the discussion. But I think the key thing to see is, I think the things that Dr. Craig was saying about the law and mens rea, none of that really gets to the objection I raised, which has to do with whether psychopaths have moral obligations. And again, I think the problem for Craig is, on the one hand, whether or not psychopaths know the difference between right or wrong, they don't grasp the morality, the authority of morality, which on Craig's view seems to preclude them from having moral obligations. Yet, for whatever reason, Craig also wants to claim that he says God doesn't let evildoers get away with their evil acts. And so if that's true, then psychopaths have to have moral obligations. So the whole saying that psychopathy is a moral disorder does not address the objection, because on Craig's view, this is a mental disorder that God should not permit by Craig's own principles.
Okay, Dr. Wielenberg, the next question is for you. The questioner asks, you appeal to theistic notions a lot to argue for your position. Why not just go all the way and become a theist? Why do you believe that God doesn't exist? So maybe he's asking, why are you a theist in the first place?
That was a good question.
Atheist.
So I think one thing that's behind this question is a lot of contemporary atheists, or at least the ones that sort of get a lot of attention, there's sort of hardcore naturalists where they say the only things that exist are what science can tell us, or all there is the physical world. And I'm not that kind of atheist. So I think there's the physical world plus these irreducible moral features of things. And that, I guess on the spectrum of views, that does push me more towards atheism. But I mean, if the question is, well, why don't you just become an atheist? That's sort of like if you say to someone, well, look, you believe in physical objects, and dragons are physical objects, so why don't you believe in dragons? Well, there's a distinction to be made. So just because you believe in some non-physical things doesn't mean you should believe in all non-physical things. But the short answer to the question, okay, yeah, why don't I sort of go whole hog and become an atheist? It comes back to the old familiar problem of evil. This is obviously, I'm just explaining sort of what my position is, not going to try to defend the problem of evil. That, of course, is a huge topic in its own right. But the combination of things that sort of leads me to my view is I think there's objective morality. Like I said before, I think I've got this Churchillian view where I think my view is the least bad explanation for those objective moral properties, but then the presence of all the evil and the various kinds of evil and so on suggests to me that it's implausible that there is this perfect being that's sort of in charge of everything. So it's kind of those two considerations that land me where I've landed.
I've wondered this question myself. What some of you might not know is how familiar Dr. Wielenberg is with the writings of C.S. Lewis. He teaches on Lewis. He knows his writings well. Dr. Wielenberg is thoroughly conversant with Christian philosophy, and I'm hoping that he still will become a Christian, especially since such good work has been done in our generation on the problem of evil. There has been real advance philosophically in this area through the work of people like Alvin Plantinga and William Alston and Eleanor Stump and others, Marilyn Adams. So I really hope that, Eric, you will work your way through this problem of evil and come to a knowledge of God in the end.
Our plan is to continue asking these questions and letting our debaters answer them till 9:30. So we have just a few more minutes to go, and hopefully time for a few more questions here. So Dr. Craig, this question is for you. It comes from Chris Davis. He asks, by what metric can we evaluate that God is truly good? If we can only use God in understanding what is good, by what metric can we determine if this idea of good is truly beneficial for humanity?
The goodness of God follows from the Anselmian concept of God as the greatest conceivable being. A greatest conceivable being must be perfectly good. Indeed, it would not be simply perfectly good, it would be the very paradigm of goodness and love. And so that is why God is worthy of worship. Again, by definition, any being that is not worthy of worship is not God. God, by definition, is a being worthy of worship. To be worthy of worship, when you think of what worship is, not just praise or admiration, but adoration, worship, this must be the greatest conceivable being, and that will entail moral goodness. So God is the metric. God is himself the metric. And he is essentially loving, fair, kind, compassionate, caring, and so forth. And so these moral values are rooted in the concept of God as the paradigm of goodness. Rather like, or rather as, the length of a meter used to be determined by that meter bar in the Bureau of Weights and Measures in Paris. It wasn't some abstract quantity. It was the length of that bar. That meter bar was the paradigm of being a meter. And in the same way, God's nature is the paradigm, the metric for what moral goodness is. And it follows from the concept of God as a being worthy of worship, the greatest conceivable being.
So I think there's some interesting puzzles and perhaps problems there, but I'm not going to actually raise an objection to anything Dr. Craig just said. Instead, I'm just going to point out how I think this idea connects with a point I made earlier, that anyone who believes in objective morality is going to have to at some point appeal to at least one, usually more, unexplained sort of brute moral axiom. And so I think in the account Craig was just describing, he said God is worthy of worship. And of course, being worthy of worship is a normative notion. So you've got, on his view, this claim that there exists a being worthy of worship. That claim has no further explanation because the being that is worthy of worship is supposed to be God, and God has no explanation outside of himself. So it's another case where, on the theistic view, Craig's theistic view, there's a normative claim that is just sort of built into reality and has no further explanation. I'm not arguing that that's false, just highlighting the fact that you can't really get away from this problem. And so again, I think when the theist wants to use this sort of a weapon against the atheist, oh, you've got these ungrounded moral claims that you're just sort of, pulling out of your hat. It seems to me that the theistic, everyone, including the theist, is in a similar position.
Okay, as I said at the beginning of the Q&A time, we wanted to make sure that both debaters had an equal number of questions, and so since we began with the first question for Dr. Craig, we will end now with the last question for Dr. Wielenberg. So Dr. Wielenberg, this question, the questioner asks, theists give arguments and evidence for their belief in God. What arguments or evidence do you have for the existence of these brute moral facts that you're positing?
So if it's the moral facts themselves, I think that again connects to the point I was making. The brute ones, my only argument is these seem right. These seem plausible when I think about it. Which again, if you are sort of confronted, explain your position, you're like, yeah, it seems right. Yeah, it could be unsatisfying, I understand, which is why a big theme of my work is, yeah, we're all in the same boat. And so again, I would characterize the difference between, I'll just take myself and Craig as a relevant example. We just pick different moral axioms as far as I can tell. And so I think that when you get down to Dr. Craig's foundational moral axioms, I don't think he really has an argument for them. I think he thinks they're the most plausible, or as he sometimes says, the least arbitrary. And I try to make the case tonight that I think some of his moral axioms are implausible, and so I've got my own moral axioms that seem more plausible to me. It's not a case of one person with axioms and the other without. It's just different axioms. Now, I don't know if this is quite what the question was asking, but perhaps another part of the question is, what's my argument for my sort of metaphysical account of the objective moral facts? Again, what Dr. Craig has called the moral Platonism. And as I said before, I think we need to posit those things to make sense of objective moral facts. I think that they're part of the best account of objective morality. So again, the structure of that argument parallels the structure of Dr. Craig's moral argument for God's existence. And so that's why I think the question of, well, which of these accounts makes better sense of objective morality is really the crucial one.
I appreciate the question because it highlights the fact that there is a variety of arguments for the existence of God. The cosmological argument, the argument from contingency, the argument from design, particularly the fine-tuning of the universe, the ontological argument, and the moral argument. I would say, as Dr. Wielenberg said, that you need to posit some sort of explanation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. And you could do it through moral Platonism, but I think a far more plausible account will be that there is this concrete object, God, who furnishes the ground for morality. So the moral argument would be part of a cumulative case for theism that I think is very powerful. And if you're interested in looking at some of these other arguments for God's existence, look at the homepage of our website, reasonablefaith.org, where we have these wonderful animated videos on arguments for the existence of God that are very entertaining but also instructive as well. So thank you for coming tonight. I think we've all really enjoyed having this debate with you this evening.
Thank you.